Trapped in a desolate world of endless ash and shadowy horrors, a lone scientist wanders through the remnants of his own destruction, searching for answers in a nightmare realm where time and space have no meaning, haunted by whispers of watching. Eyes and tormented by visions of ravenous voids, he must confront the monstrous truth of his existence before the abyss consumes him entirely. Now start real story. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. Is anybody there? I shouted out, well aware that I would receive no answer. I had been alone for a long time, months or maybe years. Longer? I could no longer recall. I took another trio of shuffling steps, and then called out again. The ashen motes that hovered in the parched air stung the back of my throat as I breathed. There was no air, though, that burning pressure for want of air that was no longer there. Though I had not drunk water nor seen food in longer than I could remember, I remained both alive and alert. The reasons for this I could not say, nor could I really recall why that might have been a cause for alarm in the first place. It was simply the way things had always been. I scrunched my eyes. What had been? That implied a past, and perhaps a future. I felt the tiniest inkling of hope stir in my breast at the thought. A modicum of emotion in this dead and gray place, but it was quickly snuffed out by the looming mountain of my own self-resentment. I knew that I hated this place and myself, but I could not for the life of myself recall why that was. I stopped, and for the first time in ages, I looked up and at my surroundings. Why didn't I do that more often? Was it really so much easier to remain oblivious? My surroundings had not changed, not in all the time I had walked relentlessly in a single straight line, not with the twists nor the turns I had taken. In fact, the only reasons I had for not believing myself in an eternal loop was the blanket of undisturbed ash that lay nearly 5 centimeters deep before me and to all sides. Deep enough that it should have been disturbed upon my passing had I been there before. Surely, would it not? I gazed upon the ash again, an uninterrupted carpet of silky particulate that piled up to the surrounding buildings like unto drifts of dirty gray snow. But it was not cold, it was not warm either. In fact, the air itself felt hollow in a strange manner, as if it was there but simultaneously not. As if the very reality I was in was some deeper fragment of a larger nightmare that I was mired in. I shook my head, the motion loosing a small blizzard of ashen flakes that obscured my vision like a curtain of sooty shreds for but a moment in eternity. Looking further afield, I say buildings, their construction foreign to me. Not the tall, imposing Duracrete edifices I had grown around as a youth, but small and squat structures of small reddish blocks. They looked old, or maybe they felt old. I could not tell consciously, but for some reason their very appearance made me feel tired, as if the weight of ages were pressing close about me like a heavy weighted cloak. It was suffocating. Just like me, I shivered, and not from the cold. Is anybody there? I shouted again, my voice nearly breaking from overuse. I was so tired, but I could not sleep. I was starving but had found no sustenance, nor would my body cease its function. I was certainly marked for death, but could not die. A voice in my own head, beyond the edge of space. A voice telling me I needed to wake, that I was living an eternal nightmare. But wake, I could not. So I wandered again. For a time, longer than the mind could reckon, I wandered along ash-covered streets of dirty gray asphalt and shattered masonry. I moved slowly, head held low so as to block out the terrible sameness of my surroundings. But I continued to move, forwards, my mind drifting along the tides of my subconscious like a fish would upon the currents of the sea. That gave me pause. The sea. I smiled involuntarily, the action creasing cracked and bleeding lips parched with endless thirst. I missed the sea, the sound of the waves upon the shore, and the cries of gulls upon the salty winds. I must have been born near to the sea, for it held a strong hold over my heart. I grasped the hope again, lest it slip once more from fingers driven to the edge of exhaustion by lack of sustenance and rest. And it held. I stopped. The new fires. of rekindled hope surging in my core and drawing a gasp of elation and fear from my sundered mind. I felt alive for a moment, at least in part. How long had it been since I had felt, well, anything? I could no longer recall. I frowned at that, the motion much more familiar to my paralyzed muscles. I had been somebody once, lived a life of joys and sorrows, but no longer, for everything was the same here. Gray, all gray and ash, dust and silence. No, not silence. Not really. Sometimes when I thought all hope had gone, I would catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my vision. It was a hallucination, nothing more. My rational mind told me so, a vision brought along by my sorry, harrowed state. A fugue of the brain in a place as bleak as hell itself, but infinitely more cruel. A trick, for I was alone and always had been. So I walked again, one foot forward, and then another. On and on and on it went, the path before me as fresh as the horror that resaturated my dwindling hopes. The growing loneliness felt like a mountain in my mind, the weight as crushing as 1,000,000,000,000 kilograms of rock and stone. Before I knew what I was saying, I uttered endless tunnels of shimmering energies, steel and fire, nothing, void once more. I stopped. What? A memory, perhaps, dredged out of the bottomless depths of my subconscious by some lingering sense of self-worth? I shook my head and threw my head back, letting out a scream of rage as the memory left me, flitting away like sparrows in the garden. I silenced myself, suddenly afraid. But why? In eons I had seen not another soul. In millennia of wandering I had not spoken, nor made contact with another such as I. So why did my body quake so? Why then did the short hairs on the back of my neck stand? I was being watched. I suddenly knew it as strongly as I knew that I was damned. I froze, the fight or flight sluggishly taking hold as some semblance of awareness took hold of my atrophied mind. I was shocked to wakefulness for the first time I could remember since I first started my wandering. I had been a scientist. Me and my colleagues had discovered something. Energy from nothing? No, it wasn't possible. But my memories told me it was. What did it mean? To tap the void? To scratch at the borders of anti-space itself? I slapped the side of my head as a splitting headache tore through the disparate fragments of my psyche. It was too much. It was far too much. Decades of lost memories and knowledge flooding my mind like a crazed kaleidoscope of broken images. Screaming and thrashing, I remained. That way for a time. Another voice not my own echoing, time without time and space without spaces. I know not for how long these thoughts assailed my gibbering madness, but I found that when I was through the throes of my despair, I knew what I was, if not the where and why of it. I was a monster, a destroyer of worlds. The most blatant form of just because we can doesn't mean one should. I wept, the burning tears cutting lines through the ash that caked my features as I lay my head in my hands. I must be dead. I thought to myself, silently, and as if in response to my thoughts, I thought I saw a shadow move in the distance between two of the old red buildings. Like a flash, I stood, my self-hatred fading in light of this new fear. For if one such as I was trapped here, what others might be lurking in the endless diffused light that seemed to shine from everywhere and nowhere all at once? I recalled at once the object of my damnation, the source of near infinite energy. That was to be my magnum opus. The void sank. The word caused me to shudder again, and I felt my body run in blind panic as a near instinctive dread filled the shattered remnants of my flayed soul. I ran, my body moving of its own accord, but the nightmares followed, for they were in me and of me. I was the nightmare. I was the monsters that stalked me in this endless place of dull gray, featureless buildings. The shadowy figures in the corner of my vision, the ashen shadows cast upon the walls of my own torment. I stopped and looked at one of the nearer structures. I really took a moment to scrutinize its construction, but the harder I looked, the less I seemed to see. Again, I turned my gaze away, and they seemed to once more fill with details. my peripheral vision picking out windows and doors, tables and chairs set out in front of quaint little diners and railings for bikes on the sidewalk. But I turned to look again, and these became hazy, indistinct. Nothing was real. I felt another flash of panic. What was this place? It was a question I had asked infinitely. Dead and gone I may have been, but not forgotten. Some dark, malevolent force seemed to remember me. Why else would I have been imprisoned in such a place of endless self-torment and dark, shadowy interiors? I wanted to curl into a ball and lie unmoving upon the ground. But even as the thought reached my mind, I knew that to stop moving would be a mistake. Once more my mouth opened and spoke, the words coming from some other place not of my own mind. Can't stop, won't stop. They are coming! They are coming! My own hoarse shout strangled the hope that guttered like a candle in the darkest recesses of my mind, snuffed it out like unto the same. What was coming? And why did the idea of seeing another in this place fill me with such uncompromising dread? I was assailed by questions, many of which had no answers. But I did know something that still made sense, so I pressed onwards, assured in my own mind that this was the only proper course of action, one damned such as I could take in. This desolate place. Another mantra entered my mind as I stumbled through the dust and ash. Space without spaces, and time without time. It had echoed in my mind before. It was as familiar as my breath, and as unwelcome as the shadows that moved in the unlight of this place. It so very nearly described the current situation I found myself in. Certainly, I could not remember a time before I was here. I had the fragments of memories of what I was, of that which may have led me to my current predicament, but not really anything approaching a time frame nor calendar. Of my misery, as far as I could tell, I existed here as I always had, for time without reckoning. An endless dark abyss, blanketed in the ash of a trillion shattered dreams. I took another step. The swirling, shifting dust stung my throat as I breathed the airless mire that filled the space around me. I gasped, lungs heaving forever and ever to draw a breath that would not come. And yet still I found that I could speak. A predicament that I dare not think to fondly on, for the answers to my questions often brought more horror than the wonderings. Is anybody there? I shouted it again, almost as if they were now the only words I dared to speak in this merciless prison. Words of safety, uttered by a damned soul for whom isolation was my only real safety. I cackled madly at that, the sound as ugly as the skeletal trees that stood on every forgotten street corner, as ugly as the wounds in the sky the stars had become. I looked around. Were the shadows listening? Were the shadows following? No, I saw them not, for in this place of illuminating darkness there could be no other than I. But that didn't mean I was safe. So, I wandered. As I did, I remembered a saying, one that stares too long into the abyss may find that sometimes the abyss stares back. I shivered. I had dared to do more than simply stare into that endless dark oblivion. I had reached out and grasped the very void itself, as if my puny mortal mind could have possibly comprehended the horror of what I had done. I siphoned its energies. I tore out its very lifeblood to fuel the depths of my ambition. But little had I known the path that my greedy, abhorrent tinkering would bring. The eyes of eternity had been opened, and in them I had seen only rage. Shuddered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on edge as I whirled around, shouting, "Is anybody there?" The eyes that watched me unseen receded again. I guess it was not yet my time. What drew them back? What drew me forwards? Or was I going backwards? I could have been. The ash that fell through the air was always thick enough to obscure the path ahead, to cover the tracks of my previous passing in a mere matter of hours. But to what purpose? I looked up, blinking as stinging flecks filled my eyes, coughing as the acrid dust coated my throat. I saw no clouds, no sky, no light nor dark. All was that empty, endless, ungray expanse, and it caused me to despair. Why was I cursed? I asked myself, then stopped. I knew why, and what was more, I knew that I deserved it. An eternity of torment, an entire world gone, like a droplet of water cast into a nuclear fire. The world called Karax, gone in a flash that tore the very guts of reality to tatters. A forever ago. What had I done? What forces had I unknowingly unleashed, and how had I alone survived? I stopped and looked down at myself, really looked, and fell to my knees in the deepening ash at the horror I witnessed. Like unto the structures that surrounded me, I found myself indistinct, and the more I looked, the harder it was for me to comprehend myself. One moment, a man, another, a darkening mist. I stood on legs that didn't exist. I breathed with a mouth that could not open and screamed with lungs that did not function. For like unto all that was, I too was ash, the faded memory of a man long dead, and cast into this omnipresent self-torture, I stopped moving and turned around to see my footprints, but there were none. I must have left some trace as to my passing, I thought. But I could not really remember ever having seen any. Had it all been my mere imagination? What was I if I was no longer a man? Again, I got the impression of shadowy tendrils emanating from my core, as if the darkness I held inside was questing to escape the confines of my body. I tried to push them back inside, but had no hands, no fingers to grasp, and no arms with which I could effect any change. I saw movement and shouted in fear more than curiosity. "Is anybody there?" Shadows retreated. The darkness held once more at bay. A day, a month, 1,000 lifetimes. I could not tell what was time without the sensation of its passing. A mere number, a concept of antithetical nature only made more apparent by the obvious counterintuitive essence of my own existence. I had been a man, a scientist, a man of great understanding, but now I understood nothing. I was as a babe, in swaddling clothes, naked and raw. An exposed nerve, flayed from my mortal body and cast aside into this place of ruin. But where I existed, so too did my ambitions. I felt that kindling fire in my core alight once more. I wandered again, my mind as free of these fears as my eyes were of their burden to see. For what was the point in seeing when all was the same? So I stopped looking, the sounds never changed, so I stopped listening. And the fears had never truly left me, so I stopped feeling. I became numb, as lifeless as the ash that floated through the space around me and then dissolved. I stopped. Something had changed. How long had I wandered? Time was meaningless in this place, with no body to preserve and no mind to break. I saw the shadows move once more. So like me, but not me. But I was no longer afraid, for what could they do to me other than remove me from this place? I straightened without moving and welcomed death with open mind. But death did not come. Maybe she never had. Not for me anyways. Maybe that was why I was cursed to never die. Death didn't exist in this other place, but that was not to say that I was alone. The shadows stirred around me more fitfully now, and I thought I could hear childlike laughter. On the wind that didn't blow, I shivered and whispered, my voice no longer full of longing, but instead marked by a sense of finality. A cold dread that filled me as the sense of my undoing drew ever nearer. "Hello? Are you there?" In response to my question, a voice answered, and then a chorus. A million teeming voices that rose and fell in a haunting harmony that seemed to sing when equal measures of joyous rapture and sorrowful lament. They echoed through the fallen city, the dust swirling in the growing wind. The voices they sang, "Yes, yes, we are here. We have always been here." From the shadows pealed a throng of things, the shapes of faces without bodies, smiling in rictus with two wide mouths of shattered needle teeth. These teeth seemed to move slightly as if each were alive, a squirming forest of silver spires that stood before a yawning pit of what looked television static. The white and black seemingly touching, but never mixing endlessly with a strange sort of visual fizzing that made my mind hurt to look upon. These things approached me slowly at first and then with gathering enthusiasm as they realized I no longer rebuked them. Each seemed to be a simple hovering sphere near to a meter in average width, their pale, near-translucent skin stretched taut over their slightly misshapen, bulbous forms. On the front of each were two pits where eyes might have otherwise been, Deep into these infinite pools of black shone a bright point of light that seemed to act in the manner similar to a pupil. This light flicking to me as they neared, a low pulsing shine like unto that of a dying star. Under this was a nose and mouth. The nose was odd, though, seemingly incomplete, or maybe it changed whenever I looked away. I could not tell. As they neared me, I was able to make out individual voices that rang, "It shines so bright! It is wonderfully luminous! It blinds! It blinds!" I would have taken a step back had they not whirled around me on all sides as a tornado. I reached out with a confident voice, for I no longer feared for life. If death was their intent, then I welcomed it. Who are you? What are you? Not in anger or fear, but flat. A simple statement of informal intent as I had left feeling. Behind. Voices that were not voices rang out in discordant harmony once more. So many that my mind reeled from the sudden disquiet. Wandering hearts, discordant thoughts. We are those that watch the watchers. Pain and fear draw us near. It was a lot to take in all at once, but I would not stop now. I may be damned, but I was still a scientist somewhere deep inside. This was simply a problem like any other. I felt a pang of fear in my heart, but I pushed it down. No, I had a task to complete now. I would get to the bottom of these creatures. I pointed to the nearest of them, which stopped in place, its deep sockets shining with that cold inner light as it hovered slightly closer. I asked, "You? What is this place? What's wrong with me?" It drifted almost, but not quite close. Enough to touch and sang slowly, "Nothing is wrong with the wronged. It is cast aside. Come and join us. We shall give it peace. Give it peace. Yes, rest." The notion of a final rest gave me pause. Could I really do it? If they offered to end the torment, would I really be strong enough to accept? A part of me still feared for life, clung to it as a drowning man might to a piece of flotsam. I answered slowly, "I fear that I cannot join you. I still have purpose. I must understand." The orb I had chosen flipped upside down as it spoke, over the discordant throng that surrounded on all sides. Its purpose is spent. Its fires burn too bright to contain. It burned aside that which was. We have been watching. He shook his head, or thought the motion. He no longer had a corporeal form, it seemed. Watching what? Me stumbling around like a lost noppin'? I want to know, where is this place? What is wrong with the sky? The orb stopped drifting, its mouth widening as it drew a little nearer. To know is to understand. Understanding does not bring peace, but we can bring peace. Yes. Join us. Peace. Sleep. I took a step back, and the being snapped its maw shut. The headache that had been building threatened to burst as my thoughts whirled like the strange creatures around me. I pointed to the ground, the ash that coated the ground. Is this real? Is any of this real? I screamed it. I needed to know. Desperation and fear mixing in equal measure fueled the sound that tore its way from me. The thing looked at me in silence. Its dark pits for eyes shone a little brighter, each dark light like a distant star in the endless expanse of dark space. The thing stopped again and turned away, but before it went, it spoke one last time. The riddle of it filled me with as much confusion as dread. It is lost in that which borders, vile rot and slavering unconsciousness. No time without time, and no space without space. Wandering and watching, watching the watchers. You are that which watches. And with that final statement, it was gone. The chorus broke as the whirling faces broke and scattered every direction at once, their voices fading into the darkness that had replaced the indistinct cityscape. I looked around, but saw naught but endless nothing. No lights, no faces, and no bleeding wounds in the sky. With nothing to grasp onto anymore, I felt my sense of self slipping away. For another moment, I held it tight, as if the knowledge of what I once was would keep me safe. But it was a fallacy, a dream. So I let go. After an eternity, an infinity, I let it all go. Freezing cold, darkness, but above all, nothing. Void once more. Now start the next story. In the nick of time. Screams echoed through the metallic halls of the space station. Not the sounds of fear, but the bone-shattering sounds of people in mortal agony. Silence followed the screams, stark in its contrast and deadly in its intent. Tomath flicked her long pointed ears and huddled further under her parents' bed. She was scared, more scared than she had ever been in her 9 years of life. Another sound this time, loud cracks like bones snapping or maybe gunshots. She tried to cover her ears with her four-fingered hands, but it was no good. Her hearing was too good. As a final resort, she tried to stuff the ends of her small blanket into her ears, and it seemed to help a little. She was confused. Father and Mother had left her alone as they did. She was plenty old enough to take care of herself. That's what Papa kept telling her anyways. Now, as the sounds of chaos and death drew nearer, she was no longer so sure of herself. She hugged her long, otter-like tail to her chest as she lay curled on her side under the bed. The bad sounds were coming, and yet here she sat like a scared little znot, just waiting to be snapped up like a tasty morsel. She uncurled. No, she would not be taken so easily. She crawled out from under the bed slowly, her retractable claws unsheathing of their own accord, in response to the mounting stress she was feeling. She wasn't sure what was coming. It could be pirates, marauders, or worse. For all she knew, the station was under attack by anti-Unity extremists. Aberthom Station wasn't much of a target, though, and the army of mining drones that it piloted were worth even less. Her own parents were drone operators, and they traveled a lot. They had only been on the station for a few months so far. She looked around the room as she tried to remember where she had put her backpack after getting home from classes the other day. After scrambling around a bit, she found it draped across the side of the living room sofa. She snatched it and emptied the contents across the floor. Books and small data slates went scattering across the floor as she rushed off towards the kitchen. She quickly grabbed some preserved meat from the fridge and stuffed it in her bag along with some water, scissors, and a knife from the kitchen counter. Zipping up the pack, Tomath made her way to the front door. She could hear the sounds of yelling and shouts coming from nearby, but nothing sounded directly outside her apartment. She cracked the door and immediately wished she hadn't. The slight smells of blood and death that had been detectable earlier were magnified 100-fold as the door was pushed open. She gingerly stepped out into the hall, keeping her stance, low with her long arms on the floor in preparation to bolt if she saw danger, but there was nothing. No danger, no bad guys with knives and guns and murderous intent. No. She looked both ways into a slightly curving hallway that was eerily quiet, like a tomb. Tomath started walking towards the main pavilion of the station, the large central. Clearing was usually patrolled by a few lightly armed System Defense Force troops. She liked them. They were professional but friendly. There was one, a human woman named Jessica, that always smiled wide with her strangely blunt teeth and called her kitten and gave her ear scratches, which she loved. Those dull fingernails seemed just made for the optimal amount of scratching. Her own fingers were nailless unless she unsheathed her claws. But that would be a bad idea. She would only have succeeded in flaying her own scalp. She rounded the bend and stopped as she heard raised voices and a strange chunky cutting, sawing noise. Tomath moved towards the sound slowly like she was stalking prey. Her soft footpads made no sound on the hard tile of the deck, and after a moment she was at the source of the noise. There was an open doorway to her left. The sounds were coming from inside. She knew that she should run. The smell of blood wafting from inside was giving her all the warning she might have needed. But another part of her needed to know. This was the room of one of her friend's family. The scaly Slavith had always treated her and her family with respect. If she could just see if they were all right. Tomath poked a single chatoyant blue eye around the corner and almost cried out in distress at the sight that greeted her horrified eyes. In the center of the room was a group of 4 people wearing the flayed skins of what looked suspiciously like other people to her. 2 were humans, while the third was a ratty-looking swaneth. Their feathers were matted and unkempt. The last figure was hard to tell, but from the hunched posture, she could just see twin pink-skinned horns peeking from their dirty black hair. A Neravith, then. That was all well and good, but the thing that made her despair was the object of their distraction. Upon the floor lay 2 piles of raw meat, the flensed scales piled around them, and their ribs smashed open. One of them was smaller than the other, and she felt a tear leak from the corner of her eye as she realized what had happened. She had heard enough scary stories from the grizzled spacers that frequented the station to know that they were probably the dreaded flesh tearers. Monstrous cannibals that suffered from deep, dark insanity. They would kill and plunder for the sake of killing and plundering. Their appetites for slaughter and wanton cruelty, well known across all of civilized space. They were worse than pirates, worse than marauders, and far, far worse than anything she had ever seen or encountered in her young life. And they were currently eating her friend as if she had been naught but meat. She must have made a noise as the nearer human's head perked up and snapped in her direction. A loud yell, followed by the sound of feet on the decking, made her scramble into a dead sprint. Using all 4 of her limbs, she tore across the deck far faster than a biped could have. Her long tail stretched out straight behind her for balance as she skated across the smooth tiles. She was fast, but still young, and after only 100 meters of her breakneck pace, she faltered. Her breathing grew labored, and her long tongue lolled out of her mouth as she panted heavily. She had gotten ahead of them, but for how long? She needed to find a place to hide. And fast. Tamath looked around as she desperately tried to regain her breath. There was an apartment across from her, but she shook her head. No, that would only cause her to become trapped. What had Papa told her about being chased? Always have an exit strategy. She kept walking, looking for something, anything, to keep her safe without becoming an easy target. She gave a small whine of fear as she started to hear the sounds of savage voices and the pounding of feet on tile from behind her. They were catching back up. Humans and Neravith alike were known for their endurance. And while you could outrun them in the short term, they would always end up catching you when your energy was gone, and you could run no farther. She paused and then darted for a set of double doors to the side of the hall. She entered into a small room filled with computers and shelves of old-style holotapes. It was the station's library. Oh, how she had wasted many a long day in here with her friends watching holodramas and playing games on the retro consoles. Aside from the dusty old chairs and creaky desks, the room was largely devoid of cover or hiding places. She rushed to the far side of the room and grabbed one of the tall shelves. She gave it a tug, causing it to shudder slightly. But it stayed put. She growled low in her throat before pulling off some of the old boxes of tapes and then trying again. Fear fueled her youthful muscles as she was able to pull it far enough away to expose the slightly rusty ventilation shaft cover in the wall behind it. She wrapped her fingers around the grate and pulled experimentally. It shifted slightly as a trickle of degraded mortar dust fell from the corner bolts. Thank Frey, not everything on the station was metal. She gave it another pull, harder this time, as she attempted to dislodge the cover. It groaned and moved a little, but not enough. She glanced over her shoulder as the voices got close enough to make out. "Where's the meat gotten to?" hissed one. The insinuation that she was simply their next meal filled her with dread. Another voice, this one gravelly and entirely emotionless as it spoke. "Yes, meat has fled. We like to chase the meat. Is so much sweeter than dead meat." There was a sound like something heavy slamming into something meaty, followed by an animalistic grunt. "No, the meat is mine. I saw it. I want to use." "The meat. Then you can have it when I am done." Another snarl, and the sound of a minor scuffle. Amid the noise, she continued to pry at the vent cover and finally succeeded with a screech of metal on stone that echoed through the vent and beyond. The hall went silent, and she threw the vent cover aside as she stuffed herself into the small space inside. It was too tight a squeeze, but not impossible if she stretched out and used her knees to move after she discarded the backpack. There was another clatter right behind her that made her whimper again, but she was already committed and unable to turn around to so much as see what was happening behind her. She heard the sounds of a scuffle, and then something thudded into the vent with enough force to make the thin metal vibrate. She sped up. The vent would not keep her safe forever, though. It was a straight shot through the station wall to the next available room. She wasn't exactly sure where she would end up, but it had to be better than where she was. After another tense minute of squirming through the tight space, she reached another grate. She pushed on it, but this one seemed solid. She growled and pushed on it harder. No luck. She beat on it with her long arms, the metal deforming under. Her fear-fueled blows. Finally, with a last screeching noise, the vent gave way partially and swung into the floor with a clatter. Not that it was really any louder than her beating upon the metal had been. She winced as she dragged herself from the vent. Her hands were bruised and bleeding from the furious assault she had laid into the metal. It wasn't her priority, though. While she couldn't straight up ignore the pain like a human, she was able to at least put the worst of it to the side as she moved deeper into the room. It was large, with tall ceilings and many tables scattered around. The mess hall, she had crawled into the station's cafeteria. She could smell blood again, though. Not a good sign. As Tamath crept around on all fours, she heard more voices. These voices seemed to be less agitated, though still gruff and violent. She poked her head around the corner slowly and took a look. More flesh tearers, more dismembered bodies. She shuddered. No child should ever have to see such things. She wanted to puke. She wanted to spit. But she could do neither, so instead she crept back into the far rear of the room and tried to find a good place to hide or escape. Not long after she had moved away from the main concentration of the flesh terrors, she heard a loud commotion and the sound of distant gunfire. Maybe that was help arriving, she hoped. But as she listened, the gunfire died down far too quickly to have been a long fight. Her heart seemed to sink out of her chest and to the base of her tail. There was no hope of rescue. She could only try and survive through this nightmare. More shouting, more footsteps. She tensed. These were coming her way. Fast, she moved to hide behind one of the nearby tables, hoping that the chairs would serve to shield her given the low light conditions. She could see easily, however. Her species had superior night vision, and her reflective eyes lit the room as if by torchlight despite the gloom. Her people, the Yaun, had evolved on a world covered in huge trees. The perpetual gloom of the underforest giving rise to their extraordinary sight. The same four cannibals rushed into the main part of the room, the lead human pointing towards the vent she had climbed from. Meat has escaped. I told you that small one would try to run and hide. Meat is too scared. Fear makes meat more sweet, though. Another of the tearers agreed, their voice like raw acid pouring directly into her ears. Yes, we will cut and slice. Slice and cut. Cut the meat, meat so sweet it sings. Screaming songs of singing sweet meat. They seemed to say in a sing-song manner, the stories were true, she thought. They must be utterly insane. Something about the depths of space could drive a man to slaughter his fellows, instilling an insatiable hunger into their very soul. She shivered again and ducked her head lower as one of the humans looked in her way. They couldn't see her. Could they? Her question was answered to her horror as the human slapped the other flesh-tearer and spoke, "Meat is there, meat hoarder." Sabradima my rabim biblaub. Grimy Swaneth was the first to leap into action, their light body making them quick in a way that the heavier humans in Neravith weren't. Tomith darted out from under the table just as the screeching avian alien landed on top of it. Their arm wings spread wide in a threatening display. The dirty Swaneth lashed out at her with a clawed foot, and she did the only thing she could think of. Tomith swiped back with her claws extended as hard as she could. She was small, only a child by her own people's standards. But even at her tender age, she was more than a match for the diminutive alien. Her claws sliced through feathers and flesh alike. The bright spray of dark green arterial blood misted the air as the thing was sent flying back into the ground from the force of her attack. She felt pain. At least one of her claws had snapped off at the root as it embedded itself in the creature's breastbone. But she had fared far better than her attacker. The Swaneth convulsed, its body leaking spurts of its poisonous green blood. She fled, the two-tone warble of pain becoming a rasping gurgle as the flesh-tearer died choking on its own vital fluids. Instead of being angry, the other flesh-tearers seemed amused by her actions. The lead human grunted loudly after her as she fled. A clean kill. It is bad to eat this meat, though. Leave it. We will catch new meat for pack. Tamath didn't catch the rest of what was said, though, as she made her way to the main doors. She skidded to a stop in the hall and yelped as she saw another two of the cannibals not more than 10 meters distant. She tore down the hall in the direction she had heard the gunshots from earlier in the hope that she might find help. She might have made it farther had something not smashed her in the shoulder, knocking her from her feet in an explosion of pain. She tried to stand again, but cried out in pain. She felt wetness on her fur and looked down. She was bleeding. She looked over her shoulder at the two cannibals who were now advancing on her. One held what looked like some sort of large, spiked cudgel, and the other held a gun of unknown make. It looked cobbled together from pipes and fittings, the scope little more than a can with a wire cross sight. But it had been enough to put her down, and now she would die and have her body consumed by the vicious cannibals. She would have cried had she not been so terrified. She whimpered as she tried to crawl away with her remaining good arm. But then something even more terrible happened. No, that meat is mine. Back off from my new meat! It was the voice of the large, bloody human. She heard footsteps, and then she was grabbed by the back of her shirt and roughly dragged across the floor back towards the cafeteria. She cried, she struggled, but all it was met with was a kick to the side and violent threats that made her gasp. The human threw her to the ground, and she curled into a tight ball as the three of them surrounded her. The Neravith drew a large knife from somewhere under their skin robes and waved it in the air. "Do we carve now? Please let me carve the meat. Meat so tender, flesh so sweet." The larger human growled, "No, this meat gutted my soft and warm like it was base meat itself. They will be my new soft and warm. You will share the meat only when I say to share. I am Pack and you are not." That seemed to elicit a reaction out of the Neravith, who spat a challenge. "Well, I want to be Pack now. You are always Pack. You are greedy hunger lover." She didn't even see what happened, but the human in charge moved so fast that she jerked in surprise. One moment they were across from her, then the next they held the skinny Neravith by the throat with a huge hand, the other gripping there. Knife-holding wrist, they leaned in close to the choking Neravith and growled, "Maybe I make you my new soft and warm? Maybe you like to feel used. You are weak meat, only good for carving. If not for carving, I would make meat of you. That is why you will never be Pack." And then they released the coughing alien to the ground, their long tail lashing in, anger as they slammed the large knife back into the holster at their waist. "Fine," they spat. The human looked down at her and then at the others. "Do not worry, I am Pack, but I will share my new meat, after I use it first." She shivered, as much from fear as from the pain of her wounds. She gave a little yelp as the human reached out for her, but she scrambled back as best she could. She tried her best to snarl at them aggressively, but it came out as more of a hiccuping wheeze as she sobbed. The large human smiled, chipped, and bloody teeth flashed in the dim light as they grabbed her feet and dragged her closer. "No, stop! Get away from me!" she yelled, but it mattered little. There was hunger in those dark eyes. And something else, something far deeper, a hunger that went beyond the mere desires of the flesh. It was as if she were looking through a telescope, directly into the void itself. She saw no soul, no pity or remorse, no unity in those hungry pits. Only death. The man gripped her legs together tightly as he pulled her closer to him. Close enough that she could smell his foul breath. The smell of rotting meat emanating from deep inside that bloody tear of a mouth. He laughed cruelly as she struggled more. "Yes, meat, struggle. You will be warmer. I like the meat hot." The way he said it made shivers go down her spine, and she screamed as loudly as she could, the sound tearing itself from deep, deep inside of her chest and bursting forth like the blood-curdling screech of a mountain lion. The Neravith wiped a hand over their mouth as they chuckled. "Yes, break the meat. Make it tender. Tender meat to whip and tear, rip and chew the meat." They continued like that, cackling as their ramblings got progressively less distinguishable. But Tomath's attention wasn't on that. She yelled again as the man reached for her clothing and started to pull it off, so she swiped at his arm with her remaining 3 claws on her right arm. The human drew back, hissing in anger and pain as she carved the light gouges out of the offending arm. She didn't even see the blow, stars filling her eyes as her head was rocked back by a punch that snapped off at least one of her fangs. She tasted blood in her mouth and gurgled in pain as her body was once more pulled violently towards the man. He smiled again as he licked the blood welling from his own arm. "This flesh is stronger than that meat. You cannot make me meat like you did to my soft and warm." She shook her head and closed her eyes. She didn't want to look at the horrid man anymore. The dead eyes, the way the skins he wore, folded and moved wetly as if they were still fresh. And they might have been. She felt him reach for her clothing again and wound up to take another swing when something grabbed her arms. She snapped her eyes up. The other smaller human was drooling as he laughed maniacally. Her long arms held in their iron grip. She cried out as they twisted them cruelly. Darkness clouded her vision as the pain in her shoulder mounted. She struggled again and let out another scream as she felt the human tug her shirt up and over her head. But then they stopped. Another sound reached her, the sound of footsteps, heavy and fast, something running on all fours. There was another gunshot and then the sound of something heavy being slammed into a wall. This was followed by a roar, the sound so utterly primal with rage and hatred that she couldn't recognize it. But the large human seemed to. And he shivered in fear at the sound of it. She trembled. What was it? What could be so horrible that even these monsters quaked at the very sound of it? It could not possibly be worse than the dark fate she had already been resigned to. Could it? As if to answer her question directly, she jerked as the cafeteria doors were smashed inwards with such violence that one of them flew entirely off its hinges to slam into one of the nearby tables. The beast that at once leapt through the door made her feel strangely calm, as if some deep part of her recognized this whirlwind of frenzied teeth and rending claws. One of the other flesh terrors from the hall was held struggling in the beast's huge hands. Their struggling ceased as the monster bit their entire throat out, and the screamed so loudly it seemed to shake the walls. "Let go of my daughter, you filth!" She blanched. It was Mother, but she had never seen her mother like this. She was wounded and bleeding from multiple places on her muscular body, the fur of her face and hands stained with the blood of several different species. Without another word, she launched herself across the hall with a speed that could only be described as terrifying. The larger human dove out of the way, but the other human wasn't so lucky. Tamath's arms were suddenly free as the man was slammed to the ground behind her. She struggled weakly, her body beaten and bruised from her experience as she watched. The Neravith pull the knife and rush her with a yell of blood-maddened fury. Their heads snapped back with such violence that she actually heard their neck vertebrae shatter as a bright blue flower seemed to appear in the middle of their face. They crumpled to the ground as another roar echoed through the space. This time she was able to recognize the voice of her father. He burst through the door alongside a tall human female in a blood-stained blue uniform. The white congressional seal of the Union emblazoned across her shoulder as she raised the gun in her grip and fired it at the remaining cannibal. The large flesh terror dodged towards her father while drawing a knife. She screamed in terror. At the sight, "Papa, look out!" But he reacted a little too slowly. She screeched as her father's arm was slashed by the blade, the big Yaun grunting as he slammed into a table. The big human grunted something and rushed him. Knife raised, time seemed to move in slow motion. Her father was rolling over, his clothing torn and bloody, his bright green eyes filled with a kind of anger she had never seen in them before. It almost scared her, almost. The blow never landed. The man jerked forwards and then flailed a bit as if trying to scratch an itch on their back they could not reach. Tamath saw their legs give out as they coughed bright red blood and fell forwards to lay still. Behind the man, hackles raised. In extreme stress was her mother. She tried to stand, her good arm reaching out towards her parents as she cried pitifully. But there was no need. Something scooped her up in a tight embrace. For a second she struggled, and then went still as a soft hand scrubbed gently through the fur on the top of her head. A voice spoke into her ear, soft and loving. "It's okay, kitten. Audie Jessica has got you. You are safe now. Don't cry. Oh, please don't cry." But she couldn't help herself. All the stress and pain and fear welled up and spilled from her bloody mouth in a wail that wouldn't stop. She saw her father being helped to his feet by her mother. The large Yaun woman was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she tried to calm the rage that had fueled her near-superhuman actions. Jessis carried her to her father, the young kid struggling to be free as she was released into her father's embrace. She nuzzled her head deep into the fur of his shoulder and hugged him tightly with her uninjured arm. She was aware of her mother speaking to the human woman, but she didn't care anymore. She didn't want to think anymore. She only wanted to be with her family. Jessica spoke up, her calm voice cutting through the veneer of bliss that surrounded Tamath's mind like a blanket of safety. "She is hurt, and so are both of you. We need to get to medical right away. That adrenaline stick I popped on you isn't going to keep you going for much longer, and we both know that I don't stand a chance carrying you there myself." Her mother spoke, her voice rough with pain and anger, the low growl still conveying the concern she had, though, and making Tomath smile. "Yes, Tomath is all that matters to me. When I heard her cry, I knew it was her. I just felt something come over me. I don't know what it was." Jessica seemed to smile, the woman looking over at Tamath as she buried half her face in her father's fur. "It's a mother's intuition. Your kind may differ from mine in many ways, but a mother's love for her children is a powerful bond in any maternal species. I am just glad that we got here before." She stopped and then grunted as Mother placed a heavy hand on her small human shoulder. "You will always be welcome in our den, Jessica. I will never forget what you did for us today, but we need to go. There are more of those monsters on the ship." She seemed to want to speak more, but Jessica's communicator crackled to life. Aberthorn Station Security, this is the CMS Navy vessel Lovely Day. We picked up your distress signal and tried to get there as fast as we could. We are boarding. Now hold tight. We have got things from here. Help is on the way. CMS Lovely Day, out. The feed cut and the air was silent. Tamath didn't know exactly what a CMS Lovely Day was, but it sounded safe. But not as safe as her papa's arms. She hugged him tighter and squeezed her eyes shut. She was safe and the monsters were gone. She sobbed a little more, but relaxed as her father hugged her back. But in the back of her mind, she knew that everything was going to be okay now. End of transmission. Hey everyone! If you enjoy these epic HFY stories, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment below to let us know your favorite part or what stories you'd love to hear next. Your support keeps the channel growing and the stories coming. Thanks for being part of this channel.